Hello, welcome to video mini tours through the Metzger Collection. Today we're going to do something a little bit different from the other times, and I'm going to highlight just a selection of pieces with a notable backstory behind them. Something that's not necessarily evident in looking at it and adds a whole new layer of depth to the piece itself, to its inclusion here in the Metzger collection, and to the history surrounding it. And of course, this is true of many of the pieces in the Metzger collection. And history in general has a substantial amount of depth that we don't know unless we dive a little deeper into it and wade through some of the story of how we got these artifacts, where these artifacts come from, and so on. And so I hope you enjoy. Now we're gonna start off in our section of Egypt, and we're gonna start off with this statue here of Moses. Now you might, well, let me ask you, do you notice anything peculiar or odd about this statue of Moses? And you might say, well, he's got some horns on his head. There's a story behind this. This was sculpted, this is a replica, of course, but sculpted by Michelangelo. And this is actually a true size of his own miniature sculpture of what later became a colossal marble statue, 2.4 meters high, now in the Church of San Pietro in Vincoli in Rome. And so this was his miniature model on which to base the larger piece. Interestingly, Napoleon III removed this terracotta reduction from the Vatican and took it to Paris during his Italian campaign. But coming back to this point about horns, why would Michelangelo portray Moses with horns? Now, I don't know about you, but typically I would associate horns with pagan mythology, even with evil, with demonic imagery, and so on. Well, in fact, none of that is what's going on here. Biblically speaking, horns is a symbol of power. If we think, for example, of a bull, well, its strength is in its horns. That's kind of the idea behind it. And so horns is a symbol of power, and that can be divine power, or that can be demonic power as well. Well, that might be a little bit of what's going on behind the scenes, but primarily the reason why Moses is given horns here is due to a translation issue. Now, Hebrew was originally written without vowels, just the consonants. And so with just the consonants, the Hebrew word for horns is exactly the same as the word for shine. And so we're used to reading in our modern translations that when Moses came down from Mount Sinai, bearing the 10 commandments on tablets of stone, just having spoken with God, well, his face shone. But in the 4th century, the church father Jerome, when he was translating the Bible from Hebrew and Greek into Latin, when he came to that passage, he translated it, Moses had horns. And his translation, the Latin Vulgate, became the standard Western translation of the Bible for the next over 1,000 years, lasting all the way into the Reformation and even beyond. And so Michelangelo, when he sculpts this, only has access to the Latin Vulgate. And in fact, he himself is picking up on a tradition of depicting Moses with horns, stemming from this passage that we read. Now, who knows? Maybe Jerome was onto something. Maybe it actually is that Moses had horns and not at all that his face shone. I don't know about you, but I feel that shine makes a little bit more sense. But anyway, that is a little bit of the backstory behind this piece here. Now, next, I'm going to come once again to this big black obelisk that we have here. Now, I noted the significance of this obelisk of Shalmaneser III previously, particularly that it has our earliest picture of any biblical figure, namely Jehu, shown here bowing down in front of the Assyrian king Shalmaneser III, paying tribute to him. Now, some of the backstory behind this piece is multi-leveled. And one level, in terms of the original artifact of this, is that was found in the ancient city of Nimrud in what is now modern-day Iraq. And you may be quite familiar with the story of 19th century imperialism, where basically European powers, aided by the technologies coming out of the Industrial Revolution, had the military might to dominate the world. And as they traveled and as they saw pieces of interest to them, particularly archaeological pieces, and this is really the same era as a growing interest in antiquities and in the discipline of archaeology. Well, as these imperialist powers, whether the British, whether the French, so on, saw pieces of interest to them, well, they took it for themselves. And so there's a whole lot of ethical issues around that. Whether these pieces that have been taken and this black obelisk that we have here is today in the British Museum. And so we might ask, well, should these pieces be repatriated? Go back to where they were taken from. And I think there's certainly much to say for that line of argument, and perhaps that is the best way forward. But another layer to this piece is the fact that this ancient site where it was first discovered, the ancient city of Nimrud, the Assyrian city, that is one of the places recently destroyed by ISIS. And so if this had actually still been there, in all likelihood, it would be destroyed today. And so there is this tension and this more complex reality that yes, we can criticize the imperialist powers of the 19th century, but we also need to acknowledge that in some cases, this has helped preserve history that might otherwise have been lost or destroyed. Now, a whole nother layer of backstory behind this piece is in its replica. And at one point in its history, it actually, I believe, fell over and shattered into pieces. Well, Fred Metzger painstakingly pieced it back together. And you can see still some of the cracks related to this, how he pieced it back together, touched it up with paint, and so we have, to this day, this very impressive black obelisk. And that's a little bit of the backstory behind that one. So we're going to continue to another. This is called the Moabite Stone, or the Metzger Stele, dating from around 835 BC. And the text that we have on it is ancient Moabite, much akin to ancient Hebrew. And our chart here helps us identify what the letters of this Metzger Stele are, or what the alphabet is that they were working on. Now, there's a great deal of significance to this piece. It documents a historical event of battle and rivalry between Moab and Israel that is also echoed in 2 Kings chapter 3. Though the narrative, as we might expect, coming from different sides, the narrative parallels but also has its differences. In this piece by King Misha of Moab, he boasts victory and attributes that victory to their god Chemosh. Doesn't mention a detail included in the biblical account of the sacrifice of his own son to their god Chemosh. This piece has several other points of interest. It possibly has a mention of David, though it's a difficult to translate passage. It also has on it the earliest archaeological mention of Yahweh, the God of Israel. And here we see the tetragrammaton, the Yod-He, Vav-He, as part of this, and part of the passage that says, I took from Nebo the vessels of Yahweh and dragged them before Chemosh. And so a great deal of significance. Now, the interest is with the backstory, because this has just an incredible archaeological story behind the discovery of the original. And so, this German missionary in Jerusalem was traveling east of the Jordan River, and he came into contact with this Bedouin tribe, which said to him, you have to come see this stone that we have. And they brought him to view this Metzger Collection, sort of buried in the ground. And this looked of significance to him. And so he went back to Jerusalem and told the German embassy, and the Germans began negotiations with the Bedouin tribe to purchase this stone. Well, the French got word of this, and they wanted the stone for themselves. And so they began their own negotiations. Well, this Bedouin tribe realized there's some value in this, and so they skyrocketed the price. Well, neither the Germans nor the French liked that, and so they got the Ottoman overlords involved. Well, the Bedouins incredibly disliked the Ottomans getting involved, and so they took action. And so whether the exact purpose behind it was to spite the Ottomans, whether it was because they felt there were magical properties in this stone, or because they felt the value was with treasure inside. We don't actually know the motive, but they proceeded to heat this stone up and then pour cold water on top, which had the effect of exploding it to pieces. And then they proceeded to put fragments of this in their grain stores. Well, thankfully, before they had done this, an archaeologist had made what's called a squeeze of it, which is to put wet paper over top, wait for it to dry, and then remove the paper, and so it would leave an imprint of the text. And so using that squeeze that they had, they were able to gather almost all of the pieces. Of course, some pieces are missing to this day. They were able to gather almost all of the fragments of it and piece it back together. And so that is some of the backstory behind this. It is, I guess, the French won out because it is in the Louvre to this day. And this, I find, is just one example that shows us how easy it is for archaeology to be lost, and some of the history behind such pieces to be lost, whether in antiquity or even in the modern age. And so that's the Metzger Collection. Next, I'm going to touch on another piece that I mentioned quite recently, or in the last video, in fact. And that is this game of king that we have, which is found on the stone floor of the Fortress Antonia, which is right adjacent to the historic temple in Jerusalem. Now, I've already said some of the significance of this piece, how it could, well, in one element is shows us this game that soldiers played, this game of king based on a Saturnalia festival, the significance that it could in fact have coincided with them mocking Jesus and enacting some of what this game represented on Jesus. The backstory that I want to mention behind this piece is how we come to have this nice full-size replica of it. We also have in the drawer here a miniature replica that you can see. The way we come by this original cast is from Fred Metzger himself. My understanding is that Fred Metzger was a little bit of a smooth talker. He was friendly. He could work his way into different situations. And so the sisters of the convent of Our Lady of Zion, where this carving is located in the basement of their convent, they gave Fred Metzger permission to make a rubber mold of the lower floor, the pavement on which is the game of king. And so after the convent was closed for visitors, Fred went to work. He spent all night with electric heaters to get the rubber dry before morning. And he managed just as the doors were opening for the next visitors. And I have been told that it's possible that these sisters didn't necessarily know what they were signing themselves up for, and how involved this process might be, and how close the timeline might be with when they need to reopen, as well as if things went badly, the potential of damaging the original floor. But thankfully, none of that actually happened, and as a result, we have this quite incredible replica. Now, the last piece I want to highlight is in our entry area, and has to, as part of this corridor, which you might not even have noticed in coming in before, but I want to especially highlight this piece. This is Rembrandt's Erection of the Cross. And this is a replica painting done by artist Maria Gabenkova. And so this is not just a print, this is actually a painting, but after Rembrandt's original. Now, this is another piece that has a great deal of depth and backstory. And notably for Rembrandt is that he has painted himself as part of this broader painting. And we see him, not interestingly, as one weeping and mourning the death of Jesus, but we see him as one helping to raise the cross, helping to crucify Jesus. And what's going on here is that Rembrandt knew well the message of the gospel and knew that his sin also participated in crucifying Jesus. And on the cross, Christ paid the price for his sin, for the sin of humanity. And so he very meaningfully places himself as part of this piece, recognizing the grace he has received through Jesus. So that's for Rembrandt. Now, let me say a little bit more about this artist, and in fact, the family of artists to which she belongs. And so Maria Gabenkova has done this piece, and she's done a few pieces in the Metzger collection, such as the prophet Jeremiah, and her parents were also artists, Joseph and Antonia Gabenek. And we have a number of pieces by them as well. And in fact, the Gabeneks went to Fred Metzger's church, St. Columba Presbyterian Church in Vancouver. And so they were close friends with the Metzgers. This one behind me of Rembrandt's mother is done by Antonia Lanek Gabenek. The Augustine in his cell that you'll see if you come down the stairwell toward the Metzger collection is done by Joseph Gabenek, as well as the large Caravaggio of the Deposition of Christ. Now, the very first exhibit that I put together for the Metzger collection was highlighting the pieces of this family in the Metzger collection. And so I actually had an opportunity to meet Maria Gabenkova, who did this piece in preparing that exhibit as well. And she has also done, if you've been to Regent College, they have a large replica of Grunewald's Issenheim altarpiece. If you go to Fort Langley, you will see a mural or a painting that looks like that. And that was done jointly by Joseph and Antonia Gabenek. And across from that painting, you'll see another similarly large size painting done by Maria Gabenkova. And so this family of artists have contributed to the art scene and are well recognized in the art scene generally, and have made significant contributions to the Metzger collection. And so that is a little bit of the backstory behind this piece as well. Well, that concludes this tour, and I hope you enjoyed it. And again, as usual, stay tuned for the next one.